What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and today's video will be my first in a series covering the popular corruptions that everybody's trying to farm. I figured I'd get the glowing, swirly death elephant out of the room first and start with Twilight Devastation. As you heard in my last video, if you watched it, which of course I highly recommend and it's right here if you haven't, Twilight Devastation is one of the corruptions that practically everyone wants to get, as it is known for doing exceptionally high AoE damage, even after the nerf it suffered earlier this patch. There seems to be some predisposition to it being the best for everyone, so I figured I'd explain why that is true, and isn't, in some cases. This video is going to focus on Mythic Plus, as Twilight Devastation is very subpar in raw single target fights, and because overall damage from all participants, healers and tanks included, is generally more crucial in hierarchies than it is in raiding. I'll start with explaining what kinds of classes benefit the most from Twilight Devastation, and then we'll proceed to break down why they do. Classes with tons of health. This is kind of self-explanatory, as Twilight Devastation's damage is based on a percentage of your max health. Tanks are the biggest culprits of this, of course, as most geared tanks will sit at over 1,000,000 health. This does, however, tie into the next point, players with very high item level gear. Most well-geared players will easily sit at over 570,000 health with their Fortitude buffs active, so this is another scenario where your health pool affects the throughput of your Twilight Devastation procs. Classes that don't scale as well with secondary stats. This is one of the real reasons why certain classes are more dependent on Twilight Devastation over other corruptions, as some specs see an exceptional damage increase from stacking a certain stat. An easy to see example is an Outlaw Rogue versus a Beast Mastery Hunter. Both of these specs want basically as much crit as they can get. However, Beast Mastery Hunters gain nearly 3 times the DPS per corruption over Outlaw Rogues when stacking the Severe Corruption, which increases crit gain from all sources. This will, of course, depend on the hunter using the popular Dance of Death build, which further fuels the need for critical strike. Although crit is by far your best stat as Outlaw, it simply just doesn't scale nearly as well, hence why damaging corruptions like Lash of the Void or Twilight Devastation are so useful to them. Specs with higher actions per minute, or APM for all you acronym abusers. You'll notice a pattern between all of the classes where Twilight Devastation is a strong option. Apart from tanks, due to their enormous health pools, most classes that see over 200 DPS per corruption with Twilight Devastation have very fast playstyles. Havoc Demon Hunters sit in an impressive 226 DPS per corruption, which is the highest value of any true DPS class, other than Fury Warriors due to their dual wielding of two-handed weapons, giving them a much higher health pool than other equally geared DPS. This is because Havoc Demon Hunters are basically GCD locked, outside of their channeled moves such as Eye-Beam or Focusing Iris. On top of that, they also gain an exceptional amount of haste due to the popular trait stacking of Furious Gaze, which further speeds the rotation. In comparison, and as I like picking on BM Hunters, which only gain 179 DPS per corruption for Twilight Devastation. BM Hunters are basically glorified buff timers for their pets, so the actions per minute of their playstyle is pretty low, since the only important factors are keeping Frenzy, Beast Cleave, and Thrill of the Hunt active at all times. Players that don't use too many GCDs for utility. Twilight Devastation only procs from attacks, meaning any GCD spent on things like healing or crowd control or other utilities will not cause it to proc. While this sounds obvious, this is something important to consider if you're a healer that is running damage-dealing corruptions in general. The throughput a healer can get from corruptions like Twilight Devastation is basically 100% dependent on your group not being a bunch of turds that eat avoidable damage all the time, so it's really up to you to decide if it's worth it or not. Players that can stay close to their enemies. This again is kinda self-explanatory, but I've seen far too many range players wearing a ton of Twilight Devastation, and then proceed to stand in fucking Dalaran while they're DPSing a boss in Shrine of the Storm. Yes, the tornado spawned by the Twilight Devastation does go pretty far, but it also swerves from side to side like a Zeppelin pilot who's had one too many Kungalushes, and by the time it reaches the enemy, they're probably already dead, or the tank has dragged it to the next frickin' dungeon. So yeah, stand closer if you're gonna wear this, or you're just wasting a ton of corruption points that you'd probably be better off investing in other pieces. Players that can position correctly. This is kinda part 2 of my last point. You need to position yourself in ways that you know you'll hit the most enemies possible, if and when your Twilight Devastation decides to proc, which will probably be when there's one guy left. But seriously, always angle yourself so as many enemies are in a line in front of you, if possible. This is even more important when enemies are not stacked very well, as you want to maximize the damage potential of this corruption. Players that are willing to play with RNG. A lot. This is probably one of the things that gets the most people, as RNG is one of those dirty words in World of Warcraft that just seems to incite the most visceral reactions possible. Twilight Devastation can do a lot of damage, yes. Or it can do jack diddly. It can proc on a full pack of mobs 3 times before they die. Or it can proc once when there's one guy left, if he doesn't die before the tornado hits him. So yes, you have to be willing to take that risk. If you aren't, this is definitely not the corruption for you. So to put it shortly, if you feel that you and your character check off most of these things, then yes, Twilight Devastation is going to be a worthwhile expenditure of your corruption limit. However, if you're like 425 and like to stand in Narnia while doing your Mythic Plus dungeons, suffer from abnormal fits of rage when it procs but hits nothing, and can possibly fall asleep between button presses because of how slow your DPS rotation is, then it's probably not worth it for you. A majority of Twilight Devastation's effectiveness really is based on your positioning and understanding of mob placement, as well as a little bit of luck. I hope this helps you guys understand a little bit more about Twilight Devastation, or even just makes you think about corruption in general and how it affects your playstyle. Feel free to comment below or ask any questions you want. I'll be more than happy to answer them to the best of my ability. I'll be covering more corruptions this week, so if there's a particular one you want to hear about next, go ahead and let me know. Thanks again for watching these videos, it genuinely means a lot to me. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.